Hi, Brad Monday here, member of our data science team at Modzy. Today we're going to learn how to submit inference jobs to different models using our Jobs API service. And I'm excited to walk you through a few examples. Let's dive in. Okay, now the first thing we'll need to start submitting inference jobs to various models is our API key. So if you navigate to your profile page in your own Modzy account, we see this Get Key button right here. Clicking this key will download a text file to my local machine, which has my full API key. And you'll notice once you click that file up, it's a two-part key separated by a period, where the first part of this key is what we consider the public portion, or the portion that we see right here, and the second is the private portion, only available to you. And you'll need this API key to run any sort of inference job or any sort of API call while you're using Modzy. Now, I will say, if you do happen to misplace that key or need to deprecate it for security reasons, you can always replace your key right here, at which point you can download a new API key. So we'll see why this matters in a second. Now, once you've downloaded your API key, it's time to figure out which models we want to submit inferences to. So here we see my own personal secure model library, where I can see all the models I have access to. In this case, I do have access to several commercial models, in addition to some open source models, but I could also deploy any of my own models that I've built. So let's take a look at the open source models we have available in this instance. We'll go into sentiment analysis. And for all models in your library, you'll see a page like this, what we call our model details page, with lots of great information when you're trying to learn about a model and figure out how to use it. This information includes a short description of what this model does, some statistics data, in terms of inferences run on this model, and some performance metrics. You could view a deeper dive into how the model was built, underlying architectures, training data, and we have this API section. And this will be super useful for us as we learn how to submit API jobs using a few different methods. So we'll come back to this in a second and move on to this test drive feature we have, where for all models that have a single input and single output, you can upload some sample data and run a job right here in our interface. And this is a great way to submit your first job in Modzy and get an idea of how certain models will perform on your data. So let's give this a try. And we're going to send this text that says, "Today is a great day to learn about Modzy," through our sentiment analysis model. So now that the job has been submitted, we'll wait and get the output directly to our screen. And here we can see the raw output that this model will return for a given input. And this is useful because when we go to submit some API jobs using curl and Python and our SDKs, we'll have an idea of how we can parse out these raw predictions and use them for whatever task we're interested in. So here we see that the model predicted that this text was mostly neutral, leaning towards positive. Okay, now that we've submitted our first job just here in the interface, let's go back to the API section and use this information to submit some jobs in a couple different ways. The first one we'll do is a curl job. So I'm just going to open up a terminal. You can do the same as long as you have curl installed, and use the exact information here to submit another job to the sentiment analysis model. Now, there are a couple things we will have to change. First is our Modzy instance URL. So in this case, we just have it as modzy.example.com/API, and you'll see in a second what this will look like when I'm pasting in my own URL. And the next thing is my API key. So remember, I downloaded my API key directly to my machine, and I'll paste that into a curl command. The other key pieces to submitting a job are the unique model identifier. Every model has one of these. The model version. So in this case, there are two available versions of this model. We're going to submit a job to the latest version, or 1.0.27. And then we need some data. So in this case, we're just going to pass through some raw text to our model. Okay, so here on my screen, you see my terminal. I am just using Anaconda prompt, but you're welcome to use whichever terminal you prefer, as long as you do have curl installed. And I'll paste in a command directly from the API section on that page that we were just working with, where I wanted to point out a couple pieces of information that you need to edit if you're following along. The first is my API key that I've pasted right here. Another important one is the instance URL. So I'm working in our demo instance right now called demo.modzy.engineering, specifying that we're hitting the Jobs API service, and then some information about the model and data that we're submitting to that model, that being the model identifier, the model version, And in this case, we're just going to submit the text hello world to this model to see what the sentiment is. So in running this job, we get some information printed right back to us on our screen, namely information about the model, the status of the job. We can see it was submitted, a unique job identifier. Every time you submit an inference job to a model, it receives its own unique job identifier that you can use to retrieve the results, and pretty much any information you might need about that job. And then there's some information about my user profile, as I was the one who submitted this job. Next, I'm going to use a command to retrieve the status of this particular job. So again, I'm going to hit the jobs endpoint as a part of our Jobs API service. Again, paste in my key. But this time, I'm going to append the job identifier to the end of this URL. So I'll take the job identifier from here, paste it on the end of this, and what we can see is the status of this job. So this is the job identifier we're looking into. Again, we see all the information about the model, and we can see the status right here as completed. So that's great. That means that this job did successfully complete. And once I know that, we can go in and actually use our Results API service to retrieve the results for this particular job. So I'll paste in a third command, where this time we're hitting our Results API service, and I'll need to append the job identifier. And just as before in our interface, we can see the raw predictions directly in my terminal right here, where we can see that this JSON structure, the class predictions key, indicating that this text hello world is 100% neutral, which makes sense. Now, this exercise in using curl to submit a job in a terminal might not be the most scalable or user-friendly, especially as a data scientist. I prefer to use other languages. But what this exercise is great for is testing your API key outside of the interface and becoming familiar with the general flow of submitting a job. It typically follows that same type of structure where we'll submit the job and then ultimately use our Results API service to retrieve the results. Okay, now we're going to address another scenario where a user may want to submit a job to a model in Modzy. I'm going to open up a new model, this one being image-based geolocation. And let's say, for example's sake, that I have several images that I've gathered, but the location of these images is unidentified. And I'd like to submit a couple jobs just in testing and doing some experimentation to this model to see if it works well on these images. Well, I'm a data scientist, and one of the tools I like to use is Jupyter Notebooks. So I'm going to show you how to construct a Jupyter Notebook using our Python SDK. And as I mentioned earlier, this section is going to really come in handy, where I can leverage this code and copy it directly into a notebook and start building. All right, what I'm going to do now is copy the code directly from this page and paste it into a brand new Jupyter Notebook. For the purpose of making this sequential, we're going to separate this into a few different cells. So we'll start by importing our API client from the Modzy Python SDK. So this requires that you have the Python SDK installed in your environment, which is very easy to do. All you need to do is use pip to install the Modzy SDK. You can view this page yourself on PyPI if you'd like, but it's as easy as opening up a Conda environment or virtual environment and using the package manager pip to install this package. Okay, so once we have imported our API client and this helper function called file to bytes, we can initialize our API client. And you'll notice we need two things here. One, our instance URL, and two, our API key. This should be familiar, as we had to do the same thing when submitting a job using curl. And so I'll put these two pieces of information each in their own separate variable. Where my URL will be demo.modzy.engineering, hitting that API extension as I mentioned earlier. And I will paste in my API key right here. And once I've done this, I can modify this client piece of code right here and make sure I'm pointing to the correct API key variable and establish my connection to the Modzy platform via this API client. Now, before we submit the job, I want to show you the piece of data that we're going to be working with right now. So all I'm doing is importing OpenCV and Matplotlib, both of which together can help me visualize this image that I'd like to process here. And here we see this image of what looks like somewhere in the Middle East area, and what I'd like to do is just pass this through this model to see where in the world this image was taken, and see if the model can predict this correctly. So this image is just called image.jpg in my local environment. And all we'll need to do here is use this file to bytes helper function that we've imported from Modzy, so that we can ultimately use this submit bytes bulk method. Now, there are several different methods within our Python SDK for submitting jobs. Those include submitting just raw text, submitting files, submitting data directly from an S3 bucket, and more. In this case, we are going to submit some embedded data and convert this raw image file to bytes. Here you see again this model's unique identifier and model version, and we're passing through the sources of data, in this case just our embedded image, to this model. Alright, so we know that this job was now submitted successfully, and we have the job identifier printed right to our screen. And as we did earlier, we're going to retrieve the results for this particular job. So within our SDK, we are going to hit our results API service and use this block until complete method, and then ultimately return the raw results.json file directly to our editor. And here, as we can see, the job did in fact complete, and we can see the results right here, where the top prediction is that this image was taken in Cairo, Northern Africa, with 100% confidence, which is in fact correct. That is where that image was taken. So again, as a data scientist, I might experiment with various models in Jupyter Notebooks. For me, it's a familiar tool that I use on a day-to-day basis for my model development and my analyses. And using our SDK, it's really very simple to construct this rather quickly. And so if you're following along, you now have the tools you need to go ahead and build a Jupyter Notebook for whatever model you'd like to test out. What I would also like to show you is a repository on our public GitHub page. So github.com/Modzy. And I direct you to this Modzy Jupyter Notebook sample repository. And specifically, a Jupyter Notebook that we've made available for you to download and play around with. So within this notebook, we've highlighted the packages and dependencies you need to install within your environment. And we've made it so that all you have to do is modify these API URL and API key variables with your own instance URL and your API key. And you should be able to just run the rest of the notebook as long as you've cloned this repository and have the utility functions that we use and the sample data image that we use. So in here, you see a few more functions that we didn't use in that first notebook. Namely, we use our models API service, where we can get all the information stored in the Modzy database about this particular model. And so in this example notebook, we're going to submit a job to this automobile classification model, where again we need to define the model identifier, model version, and define our data sources. And then what you'll notice here is 3 lines of code, really the 3 lines of code I used in that last notebook to submit a job, where I'll first submit the job using our job service, and then these 2 lines of code where we block until complete and extract the results using our results API service. And so for this particular example, we're going to pass this BMW car image through as input, print the output directly to our screen here, where the top predictions a BMW M3 Coupe, year 2012, with a probability score of 0.799. And then what's cool about this example is we demonstrate an example of a model that has explainability built into it. So here what we're seeing is the RLE mask displayed over the original image. And RLE stands for run length encoding, which is a simple method for storing binary masks. So in this case, instead of outputting an entire image of this mask with each of the RGB values, RLE format provides a list of start pixels, starting from the top left of the image, followed by a number of pixels after each of those start locations that are included in this mask. Where these lighter pixels right here were the most important pixels that went into this model making this prediction of a BMW 2012 coupe. So if you are experimenting and playing around with Jupyter Notebooks, I would encourage you to go to our GitHub page and navigate this Modzy Jupyter Notebook samples, clone it into your repository, and start running jobs with it. Okay, we've now submitted jobs a few different ways to several different models in Modzy, starting with submitting your first job just in the interface, submitting a job using curl in a terminal, and then we just constructed a Jupyter Notebook using our Python SDK. I've really just scratched the surface of the very many integrations that are possible to build with the Modzy APIs. Thanks so much for tuning into this video. It's now time for you to go start submitting inferences to your models and building applications around these AI capabilities.